topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, hello and welcome. This is Bill Martinez, and we are live. You know, so much is happening around our world. Borders are being invaded, especially ours here in the southern border, in the north as well, if the truth be known. But the fact of the matter is that this global movement to I embrace this multiculturalism dynamic that is happening not only here in America, but around the world. And I think that we can learn a lot from what's happening in other countries. Last month, our next guest writes in his latest column that the famed psychologist Jordan Peterson called multiculturalism a miracle of stupidity. First of all, we've always had a multicultural world, right? Well, and that's why he says there's been wars. So along with multiculturalism goes wars when the cultures don't get along. It's pretty much, that simple. Selwyn Duke, who is a writer for the New American, is clearing up the confusion over the oppressor-oppressed victim dialectic. I know that's a mouthful, and there's a lot to break down here. But really, when you break it down, you realize it's not all that complex, is it, Selwyn Duke?
Not in a way, because truth doesn't change, right? It's always the same. It was the same 10,000 years ago as it is today. It'll be the same 10,000 years from now. So the truth is that a lot of people, Bill, try to make things complicated because they don't want to accept what the truth is. So they rationalize and they go through all of these intellectual contortions, right?
Well, I think sometimes what happens is because they graduated from elite school and they have to come up with a new language and sound so uber intelligent. So I think just on purpose, they make things complex because after all, they were the ones that invested $250,000 in this education, and they got this beautiful diploma that says that they must be the elite of the elite. And so they get to show off for us, right?
Right. Well, George Orwell once said, some ideas are so preposterous or so absurd that only an intellectual could believe them. And it really is true. And I've often lamented that we've replaced wise men with intellectuals. We don't really need intellectuals. We need wise men. We need that same cave, that stereotypical thing. But yes, absolutely. Some people are really educated beyond their intelligence and educated out of their common sense, right?
Without a doubt. And you bring up a good point here, because wise men, doesn't necessarily have to be associated with an age. Sometimes you have a wise person that could be, 4 or 5 years old and say, looks to me like the king is not wearing any clothes, right?
Absolutely. You have to remember, people have different gifts, Bill. Some people have the gift of wisdom. They do. And if you take someone like that and you age him a number of decades, then you really have something. And you don't acquire wisdom in an Ivy League school, in the halls of academia, in the halls of politics or power. Wisdom is something that, again, can be a gift, and then you can cultivate it, but you cultivate it by seeking truth and developing discernment. That's how you do it.
Well, what happens when you have a culture that wants to abandon the source of wisdom, the gift giver, then, that really puts you behind the 8 ball and at a disadvantage, because you're ignoring the very source of wisdom in the process of claiming your own intellect. So in other words, you're going to discredit God and put yourself in God's position. Like that's never been done before, right?
Right. Well, you have to remember, the whole idea that there is such thing as wisdom is predicated on the idea that God exists. Because what is wisdom? It's properly defined. I'm not talking about some newfangled definition, but it's properly defined as, quote, knowledge of what is good or true. Now, what is
Mhm.
true? True refers to truth. And if there's no God, there's no truth, then everything is just relative. And then there can't really be any wisdom. It's whatever works for you. And then everything
Right.
boils down to that formulation occultist Aleister Crowley put out, where he said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." So when we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about discerning truth. When we're
Right.
talking about truth, we're talking about something that comes from God, that's
Mhm.
objective and that exists apart from man.
Exactly. And what I have been seeing here, and I say being allowed to see and bear witness to, Selwyn, is the fact that there is a definite infrastructure and design to this whole universe. And so that when we are true and we're operating in rhythm with the infrastructure of said universe, it goes well for us. In other words, if we want to be silly and violate gravity, for example, we find out when we hit the ground, maybe not a bad idea. We probably don't want to do that again, depending on how hurt we got. But regardless, because sometimes there's just some people go, nah, maybe it was just an anomaly. I can
Mhm.
try jumping off this building one more time until they finally realize, nope, it's pretty much a law. It's consistent. It is consistent with the infrastructure that has been designed for our use and our benefit. And when we violate that, we pay a price, don't we?
Well, we do. We do. I mean, look, I'm not the biggest fan of Ayn Rand, but she did say one thing. I like this quotation. She
Mhm.
said, "You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of avoiding
Exactly. Yeah.
reality."
Mhm.
And the bottom line is that everything boils down to truth. And for instance, you opened talking about multiculturalism, which I've written about recently.
Mhm.
Multiculturalism can only be entertained by people who are moral relativists. Now, why do
Yeah.
I say this? Well, I said this many years ago that multiculturalism, now follow this here, really is a Trojan horse for moral relativism, because multiculturalism always held that all cultures are morally equal. The problem with that is that since different cultures espouse different values, not all cultures can be equal unless all values are equal. And if you
Exactly.
say that all values are equal, that's moral relativism. It's
Mhm.
obviously not true. And that way lies destruction. And this is why it's so important to be moored to God, to be moored to truth, because then you look at things with a discerning eye. You don't say, well, let's just take any and every culture into our country. Let's see how it all works out. After all, they're all equal. It's like a flavor of the day. It's like ice cream. It's a matter of taste. You try it to see what you like. No, you approach it with that discerning eye and you say, okay, wait a second. Here's what this culture says. Here's what that culture says.
Mhm.
Is it going to
Right.
be compatible with our culture? Is it going to make us better, or is it going to make us worse? You're going to ask
Exactly.
that question.
Mm. Right. And clearly, I mean, just as a quick example, we saw what happened with Israel and Hamas, right? Hamas, what Hamas did, I think most people, reasonable people, would see it for what it is, that it was terror, what they did to women. Benjamin Netanyahu here recently, I think the other day, finally spoke out and said to the international community, hey, hello, it's been 8 weeks. Jewish women were raped. They were, which, oh, yeah, by the way, you guys keep talking about, war crimes, clearly a war crime, raped, dragged naked in the streets. And the other thing that hasn't really been brought to bear on this, Selwyn, is that you had Palestinians in the streets cheering this on. So, it, you know, and talking about what and bringing reference to what you were saying in terms of value, you've got to consider what are the values of the Palestinians that would cheer on a woman who has been raped being dragged naked in the streets of their city, and nobody stepped forward to say this is wrong. No one.
Yeah, well, absolutely, absolutely. And this is a problem we're seeing all over the world. We're seeing this conflict between certain Islamic cultures and others. We see it in Nigeria, we see it in the
Mhm.
Philippines, in many, many places. So anyone who thinks it's just a function of Israelis' presence in the Middle East, or it's just a function of the Jewish situation, no, it's not. And
Mhm.
I often point this out. Now, this is a political incorrectness alert. I'm going to say something very politically incorrect. But there was an interesting study that was released in Germany in 2010, I think it was. And what they did was they studied 45,000 youths. And what they found, Bill, was that with increasing religiosity, Christian youths became less violent. But with increasing religiosity, Muslim youths became more violent.
Right.
Now, that's very, very interesting. Now, we can discuss why that is if you're interested. I certainly have some ideas.
Well,
But
let's
yes,
go ahead. Ben, since you brought it up, I think it's important to understand because this is something we've been talking on the radio show as well, Selwyn, is that when you look at the difference between the left and right, it would seem that the consistent theme of that on the left seems to rhyme with destruction and loss of life. That seems to be a consistent attribute with the left, whereas on the right, I'm not seeing damage of property. I'm not seeing a lot of smash and grab coming out of those from the right, if I might put it in terms of left and right.
right. Well, absolutely. I mean, I guess we're going off on a tangent, but sure, I've often made that point. You have leftist propagandists in the media and politics trying to portray it as if the right is responsible for all the violence, when I have to say they're really projecting there, because if you look at the reality of the situation, they've used January 6th now as their Reichstag fire moment. But the
Right.
truth is we know there were government agents there trying to foment problems. We know there were agents provocateurs among the crowd, for one thing. Not only that, that was one instance. It was not an insurrection. You want to talk about violence? Well, here was a real insurrection. You had the Chaz insurrection, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. That was in Seattle, right?
Right. Exactly.
And they actually said they were starting their own country. We have the leader of that little uprising, Raz Simone, video of him giving a follower an AR-15 from the trunk of his car. And as far as I know, nothing has happened to him. He hasn't even been brought up on charges. But that was a real insurrection. Now, admittedly, I'm not going to overstate the case. It was a lame one, but it was an insurrection nonetheless. Then we had the 600 plus violent left-wing riots in 2020. Has everyone forgotten about that? We had, I think it was in May 2020, the attack on the White House, which was so egregious that Trump had to be ushered into an underground bunker.
Exactly.
You want
Right.
to talk about, attacking our capital city? I mean, the whole thing is just unbelievable. So the left, it perpetrates all this violence and then tries to make it seem as if its hands are clean and that the violence really originates with the right. It's unbelievable. And when you can control the media, you can propagandize people in all sorts of ways very effectively, can't you?
Yeah, we really have turned it on its head. I mean, the Bible warns us of the time that we will come to when evil will be called good and good will be called evil. And here we are. It is in the midst of us right now. And for those of us who want to call it for what it is, not because so much that we want to be right. That's not the point. The deal is that we want to return, if that's possible, to an America that you and I grew up with. That there was some hope, that there was a chance to realize the American dream, and that is, being able to exercise your gift and talents to be all you could be, provide for your family and to live in peace. But unfortunately, there are those antithetical forces that have been around forever, and they come and they go, just like you say. History is very clear. But if you do not take a stand against the evil when it lifts its head, then you're going to be dealing with the kind of stuff that we're dealing with here, not only in America, but around the world. We've got some 32 wars right now that people seem to ignore. We know about Ukraine, we know about Russia, we know about Israel and with Hamas, but there are so many other, countries that are dealing with wars, 32 in total right now.
Right. Well, absolutely. You said we have to be on guard, no question. Now, I'll just mention in passing, we understand now that Venezuela is pondering invading neighboring Guyana and taking 78% of its territory. But anyway, on to the deeper issue. As far as being on guard goes, G.K. Chesterton, whom I quote once in a while, put it very, very well. I'll paraphrase him. He said, The great flaw in conservatism is in believing that if you leave things alone, they remain the same. No, if you leave something alone, it becomes subject to a torrent of change.
Right.
And that's absolutely true. I often put it this way, Bill. It's like if you take a house or a car and you just let it sit somewhere in the country and you don't give it any attention. What happens? It degrades.
Exactly.
Constant maintenance is necessary, a continual application of energy to maintain what you have. And civilization, culture is no different. Without a continual application of energy, it descends into chaos, into disorder, because things naturally move towards disorder. And unfortunately, we have not been vigilant in that regard. Why do you think one of our founding fathers said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty? Yeah, because actually, I'm not sure if that was a founder, but yeah,
Right.
eternal vigilance. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Ronald Reagan himself said we're only one generation away, to your point. Again, these warnings have been echoed through our history, and we get busy and we take our eye off the ball. And when you look at those three most powerful words in the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, we the people, it really infers that we must be involved. It more than infers it. If you look at it in a casual approach, then you'll be laissez-faire about your active participation in this constitutional republic. By design, it demands your participation. If you check out, just like you said, the natural regression on this plane is toward obsolescence.
Yeah, well, there's no question about it. I mean, you have to remember that the default for mankind is to live in tyranny, right? For almost all of human history, that was the norm. We didn't have representative government. We didn't have the rights that we recognize today. Our founding fathers were real anomalies on the world scene. All these amazing men came together in the same place and time to create the greatest government, the greatest civilization this world has ever seen. There's no question about it. But when you understand it's an anomaly, you realize, well, that's another reason why you can't just sit back and let nature take its course, because nature, quote unquote, is going to bring us back to that historical norm, that historical default tyranny. Okay.
Exactly.
Now, how do you actually contravene that? What do you do? Because we're talking a lot about problems, but people need to talk about solutions too. And maybe I should have saved this for the end of the show. But basically, I think I said this on your radio show, Bill. If we're worried about the undermining of the morals of our nation, of demoralization in that sense, well, what's the solution? The solution is the opposite: moralization. Well, what does that process entail? I put it this way. If morality came in a jar, what would be on the ingredients label? Well, the virtues would be. Virtue refers to that set of objectively good moral habits. And the virtues are things like courage, hope, faith, love, chastity, charity, diligence. There's a whole host of these things. But once you understand this, it becomes very, very clear what needs to be done. Bill, I had someone say to me years ago, a very nice woman talking about raising kids. Well, you just have to get lucky. She was talking about raising a good kid. She meant well, but she didn't understand what I just articulated.
Exactly.
It's not a matter of luck. When you understand these principles of morality, then you understand this. It's like in tennis. If you want to help a kid to become good in tennis, you learn the principles of tennis and you inculcate them in the child. This is the same thing. You learn the principles of morality, namely the virtues. Then you model them for kids, you try to inculcate them in kids, and you try to cultivate them in yourself and in your civilization. That is how you bring things back. And that, Bill, is why the founding fathers talked so much about virtue. They did. They didn't just talk about freedom. No, they talked about also how virtue was a prerequisite for it.
Well, they knew that our Constitution was designed for a moral and righteous people. I mean, that was said. I think John Adams said it specifically. And this is, again, it demands vigilance where, just like you're saying, if you're raising a child who's playing tennis, you don't just check on him or, let him go out and practice tennis, one time a month. This is something that he does repeatedly. I like the story of Kobe Bryant, Selwyn. When he was growing up, he was one that was constantly on the basketball courts. And he realized at an early age that he was willing to put in 3, 5 hours a day into basketball while the other kids were distracted and they were doing other things. Well, look at the end result. Here you have, you talk about anomalies. Kobe Bryant in and of himself was quite an anomaly, but it didn't happen by accident. It was on purpose by design, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, I really want to emphasize this. Getting back to tennis or other things, parents will spend an enormous amount of money on tennis lessons or music lessons or soccer training, things that are fine in and of themselves, but basically they're frivolity. But then many times they behave as if somehow their kid is going to become virtuous just naturally. No, it's the same thing. That also requires focus. The Bible says, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, what is the operative word there? Train. It
Yes.
didn't say tell. It didn't say show. It said train. We all know what training involves. Training is a process. Yes, it involves showing and telling, but also it involves a lot of practice and a lot of repetition, which is the branding iron of knowledge and of virtue. And that is very, very important. And we've forgotten that in our society, haven't we?
We have. And the thing is that, with athletics, with sports and competition, I can tell you, I grew up in an athletic family. Our dad coached us, in Little League and Babe Ruth, American Legion baseball and that. And we were very, very blessed to have some great coaches, the likes of like Coach John Wooden, that didn't just, teach basketball. He taught citizenship. He taught these values that you're talking about. It's rare these days to have coaches like that. But when you have them, and they can be in all types of organizations and sometimes in the least that you would expect, it could be just leading a little league team or a soccer team or that. But there's coaches out there that have a heart and they're gifted in training a child up. And if you have a coach like that is around your kid, you can thank God for him, and whatever you can do to support this coach, you want to do that and come alongside, because yes, you want to have people who can help, that you can network, that are doing what Selwyn is talking about. And that is, we train a child. Now there's all kinds of instructors, but just like with ideas, we need to be vigilant about, who is instructing our child, who is depositing information into the minds of our kids, especially with what we've seen after COVID, when the curtain was pulled back, Selwyn, and we saw what our kids were exposed to in our public educational classrooms.
Right. Well, absolutely. But what we're witnessing, which is an abomination, didn't happen overnight. This
Oh,
is the
no.
result of a process. Each
Exactly.
succeeding generation has degenerated from the previous one. That is the truth.
Yeah.
People will complain about today's kids, but you have to point out who raised them. Didn't come out of nowhere. And I'm
Right.
not trying to put the onus on any generation in particular, because if you talk about the generation that raised them, well, then you have to say who raised them.
Yes.
The point is that we talk about the founding fathers, and what you see happen in civilization is you see often some very spectacular or unusual people found a civilization, and then succeeding generations really can't maintain it forever, and things start to degrade. It's just like if a man founds a business or a restaurant. Maybe he hands it down to his son. Maybe his son does a decent job, but eventually things can break down. And unfortunately, that's what has happened. And now I wrote about this just recently. Education is now an absolute train wreck. There's no discipline within the context of the schools. The kids are in there. They're disrespectful towards teachers. They're cursing. There's violence. They're on their cell phones all day long. They're not learning much. And this is really disastrous. And by the way, why we're allowing cell phones in school is beyond me. Obviously, that should be disallowed. That's the biggest distraction in the world for all of us, adults too.
Right.
So it's very, very disastrous. And it's disastrous, again, Thomas Sowell put it very, very well. He said, I'm paraphrasing now, in essence, each new civilization, or each new generation, I'm sorry, is in essence an invasion of civilization by barbarians who must be civilized before it is too late. And that really is true. That's
Right.
what it is with children. That's why Reagan said, you mentioned this earlier, freedom is always just one generation away from being extinguished. Because if you don't do a good job of molding the next generation, they're
Mhm.
going to be wild, brutal people who will be
Exactly.
incapable of maintaining a constitutional republic. You mentioned John Adams, what he said in 1798. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. The founding fathers, many
Mm.
of them expressed that sentiment in different words. Edmund Burke, the Anglo-Irish philosopher, said it very well. He said, "It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters." And that's what really should scare people today, Bill.
Yes.
Not what's happening with Russia or Ukraine or even China, which is
Mhm.
our greatest geopolitical rival. What should scare us is the fact that the moral decay is now so rapid and so widespread that we're not going to be capable of perpetuating legitimate, just freedoms. No, we're going to
Exactly.
be descending into tyranny if we don't right this ship.
And it seems, Selwyn, as we look at the current condition, the state of affairs, we're so close to losing it. We've been saying for a number of years now that we're at the tipping point, and I believe we're at the beyond the tipping point. We're on the downside of the hill. That's why things are moving so quickly. I mean, you look at what's happened in the last 5 years. I mean, drag queen story hour, sex change, our children being mutilated. You can mail order abortion pills sent across lines, sent to young girls that are left in their apartments or their homes by themselves without a doctor, that are going to expel a baby, and right there in their toilet. I mean, what? I mean, how? I mean, speaking of being barbaric, I mean, what is going on with our civilization?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you believe in God, then you have to think, well, is God really going to smile on a civilization that does all these things, that violates his laws so egregiously, that basically thumbs its nose at him? And it's
Mm.
not that God is necessarily going to, quote, punish us, but he just might say, well, look, if they're not interested in me, hands off.
Yes.
I'll just leave them alone and leave them to their own devices. But
Mm.
even if you don't believe in God, here, let me frame it this way. Let's say you saw a man, someone close to you, who was really descending down a dark hole where he was starting to do drugs more and more and drink
Mm.
more and more. And he wasn't showing up for work on time. And then he loses his job and he's engaging in a lot of promiscuous sexual activity. And you just see him on this downward slope. Well, what are you going to conclude? You're going to say, well, hey, if there's not an intervention and a successful one,
Right.
well, my friend is going to really be in a bad way. He's going to kill himself, probably. Well, here's the thing, Bill. Is it any different if you witness that with two people, or with 10, or with 1,000, or with a whole nation of people? You
Exactly.
see, that's really a good way to analogize what's happening with our civilization. There
Mhm.
needs to be a serious intervention. And barring that, yes, we're going to collapse. And what's going to emerge from that is not going to be something we're going to like very much. Because let me say something to all these left wingers. You talk about all these freedoms that you want, and your idea, you leftists, of freedom is very, very distorted.
Mhm.
You want the freedom to engage in any kind of sexual activity you want, to express yourself however you want. When the kind of regime that you dream about comes to fruition, you're not going to have any of those freedoms because
Right.
it's going to clamp down hard. Just like in the Soviet Union, you think they tolerated all these elements that would destabilize civilization? No, because
Mhm.
once the kind of people we're talking about, the tyrants, have power, they no longer want these destabilizing elements running
Oh,
around,
no
and they
way.
clamp
Exactly.
down hard.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they will you're a useful idiot until you're no longer necessary. And once the tyrants are in control, you're unnecessary. It's like, it's like what's happening. You see, gays for Palestine. It's like, what? Do you understand what you are promoting here? You're promoting an entity that as soon as they get their hands on you, they're going to throw you off buildings. And this isn't stuff that's made up. This is what they do. This is how they treat gay people. So, it's so upside down. But to your point, they will utilize these tyrants that are hoping, for this great utopia that they think's going to come about, they'll take advantage of the useful idiots until they don't need them anymore.
Right, right. Well, absolutely. It reminds me of the story of the Kronstadt sailors. Maybe you know about it, but it's very
Mhm.
interesting. Well, who were the Kronstadt sailors? Well, they were, we understand, an elite group of fighting men who were stationed at a fortress on Kronstadt Island in Russia.
Mhm.
And this was prior to the Russian Revolution. Well,
Right.
what happened was these men were the sons of peasants, basically, probably pretty good guys in
Mhm.
general. Well, they fell under the sway of a female poet who filled their ideas with filled their heads, I'm sorry, with all sorts of ideas about a worker's paradise and a utopia. Well, what happened was they bought it hook, line, and sinker, and they helped facilitate the Russian Revolution. They were instrumental, we understand, in its success.
Mhm.
Well, so then the Soviets took power, and sometime after that, these sailors started getting letters from home. Again, they were the sons of peasants and whatnot.
Right.
Well, they started reading about how the peasants were being abused terribly and brutalized. And one of them actually wrote, "It makes me sick to my stomach to think that I was part of this."
Yeah.
Well, they rebelled. And what happened? They put up a very good fight, but eventually they were vanquished, and about
Mhm.
7 or 8,000 of them escaped to Scandinavia, I believe. And the rest died in Soviet gulags. I think that's the story. And
Mhm.
that is the story of the Kronstadt sailors. It's also the story of the useful idiot. And it's
Yeah.
a cautionary tale because you have to remember, as I said, they were probably good men. You don't have to be a bad person to fall under the sway of evil like that and to enable it. You just have to be someone who falls victim to lies, because we all know what the road to hell is paved with good
Exactly.
intentions. So
Mhm.
again, that's a cautionary tale. And the problem, though, Bill, is you can't tell the left wingers this because they won't listen. They're
No.
operating based on emotion,
Mhm.
not based on reason. And
Exactly.
they're just going to say, "You don't know what you're talking about. You're evil. You just don't care. You're a bigot. We know what we're doing. This is different." And that has been said over and over again all throughout history. And it
Mhm.
always ends in the same way. This
Exactly.
godlessness always
Mhm.
leads to the gulag.
Well,
Godlessness to the gulag.
it's what the Bible refers to as a fool, and how when you when you come in contact with a fool, you want to disengage because they're not going to add to your day, no doubt about it. But by the same token, you also need to know how to adjudicate said fool when they grow in enough numbers that they start making an impact. Initially, they're just the silly people on the street until next thing you know, they start leading a parade of fools, of like-minded people that are so ideologically fixed, as Jordan Peterson would say. And I love this one: is that you become so ideologically fixed that you render yourself stupid. I mean, this is self-inflicted, isn't it?
Well, it is. It is. And you see, again, it's not having a love of and ability to recognize truth. If
Mm.
from the time kids are very young, you inculcate them with that knowledge that truth exists and that love of truth, they're going to seek it in all things. But the
Mm.
problem is that today, most everyone is a moral relativist. I've
Right.
mentioned this before. I have said this for a very long time, for decades, that moral relativism is the characteristic philosophical disease of our time. I didn't need vindication, but some years ago, I found a study that vindicated that assessment. In
Mhm.
2002, the Barna Research Group
Right.
released a study showing that back then, only 6% of teenagers believed that morality was an absolute phenomenon. The
Mhm.
rest were relativists. And get this, among, quote, born again teens, what percentage believed in absolute truth? Well, truth is absolute by definition.
Mm.
9%.
Yeah. Right.
9%. Think about that. And they claim to be born again. Again, doesn't mean they don't mean well, but
Mm.
they've missed the whole point of their faith. Okay.
Exactly.
Because
Mm.
Jesus not only said there is truth, he said he was the truth. That
Right.
is central to Christianity. And by the way, if you want to know, folks, why young people are drifting away from Christianity, that is a big part of the reason, because after all,
Mhm.
what did Jesus say? He said he came here to save us from our sins. He died for our sins. But if there's no truth, if everything is relative, then there are no sins. There are only
Exactly.
perspectives. There are only
Yeah.
tastes. And then there's no reason for Jesus to die. It renders the sacrifice on the cross incomprehensible. So if I were a relativist, I would do exactly what these young people falling away from the church do. I would say, hey, why constrain my life with the teachings of Christianity? I should rather be a hedonist, or
Yeah.
at least maybe a Unitarian.
Right. But you're
I know
not.
I insulted Unitarians there, all three of them. I'm sorry.
But you're so disingenuous in the sense that you're going to sit there and stare at the cross with Jesus hanging from the cross and going, "What a waste!" You know,
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. How arrogant that. But you see, this is what's going to happen. Is as you say, these numbers, but it goes back to what you said earlier. You got to look at the generation that's raising these kids. Back then in 2002, when George Barna did that research, it was, what do you say, 6%. I think now it's down to 4%, and it's still heading south. Could be about 3% right now. I think the last time I spoke with him, adults, less than 10%. So those are the parents. And we've got pastors in the church, in the pulpit today, less than 50% hold to a biblical worldview. And at the basis of the biblical worldview is the truth that you're talking about, Selwyn.
Well, absolutely. And that's why for so many years I've been putting forth arguments trying to combat this. And one of them is this, and let me repeat it now because I think it's important, because a lot of very good people will claim, well, you can't really know what the truth is. Who says there's truth? Everyone has a different perspective. Okay. Well, someone very close to me knew a man who told him, well, murder is not wrong. It's just that society says it is. Now, I suspect this individual might be a sociopath, but that's not really the point here. Okay.
Right.
The point is this: how would you contend with that? How would you argue against that? Now, I know what I could say. I could say, well, that's not true because God exists. God has a will. God has truth. And he has dictated that murder is objectively wrong. Now,
Right.
that man might disagree with my premise that God exists, so on and so forth, but he can't disagree, or at least he can't refute my logic. My logic is airtight. But how would you, if you're an atheist or if you don't believe in truth, argue with him? Because your premise is basically the same as his. Your
Right.
premise is that society is all there is to say that murder is wrong because society is all there is to say anything. That's
Exactly.
the truth if there's no God. And that's also the truth if there is a God, quote, some force out there, but it's an existentialist kind of situation where he really doesn't have a will for us and he doesn't care what we do. Then it's also that situation that society is all there is to say anything. So that's a point to ponder. It's a point to ponder. And there's one more argument I could make, but I don't want to monopolize this.
Well, no. It's okay. This is what I appreciate about our relationship, Selwyn, is that we're able to have a free flowing discussion that I know that our audience in viewership is hopefully being blessed by it, because my heart's desire is always that I would add to your day and not take away, that as a result of conversations on this show, whether it's the radio or the TV show, would make you better as a result. My old mentor in my early days of radio would always say to us that your job every time you open up the microphone is to elicit a positive emotional response. And what we're doing here, my prayer is that we are doing that we are eliciting a positive emotional response, from our audience, to where it's getting them to think and going, okay, this starts to make sense. I'm starting to connect these puzzle pieces in such a way to where it's my own knowledge, and it's not just what Selwyn and Bill are telling me, but that I'm beginning to own this of myself, and that we don't just go off and sound like a bunch of bumper stickers from a car that are kind of loose and going with the wind.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so really relativism has to be combated, and relativism, moral relativism, is the idea, of course, I guess we should state this, that what we call morality is really just a function of the time and the place and the people, that it doesn't come from anything outside of man. And of course, that's another way of saying that morality doesn't really exist. And that's the problem with that. So maybe I will present my second argument, and I've been doing this for decades. And I put it like this. Let's ask the question, who or what determines what this thing we call right and wrong is? Well, there are only two possibilities. Either man does or something outside of man does. Now, if it's something outside of man, something above him and inerrant, namely God, then we can really say that right and wrong exists. We can say that morality exists. It's something objective, okay? But what are the implications of saying that it comes from man? Well, let's look at it this way. Let's say you determined that 90% of the world disliked vanilla and loved chocolate. Would that make vanilla wrong or evil? Well, we know that's not the case. It's just a matter of taste. It would be ridiculous to say otherwise. Okay, but how does it make any more sense saying that murder is wrong if the only reason we say that is that the vast majority of the world prefers that we not kill others in a way the vast majority of the world considers unjust? If, as with flavors, it's just a function of human consensus, then it lies in the same category as flavors, that of human preference. That's all there is. And believe me, this idea has taken hold. I know most people don't think it through that thoroughly. But listen, I remember Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer, when he was in prison. He gave these interviews. It was very interesting because in prison, he said that he experienced a conversion, and I believe that it was sincere because of the philosophical depth that he demonstrated. But here's what he said at one point about his descent into darkness. He said that the theory of evolution affected him, and he said, my thinking was, if we all just emerged out of the muck, then what difference does it make? And at one point when he was a teenager, he reportedly said to his parents, quote, if there's no God, why can't I just make up my own rules?
Exactly.
And again, it's like a Lester Crowley, the occultist. It's the same way of thinking. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. If you think things through, you come to one of two conclusions. Either God and his will, truth exist, and therefore morality is something real, or no, it's all just a matter of preference. And then it doesn't matter what you do. Hey, whatever works for you. But that way lies madness. And that is the hole, the rabbit hole that we've been going down for a very long time in Western civilization.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, this is why we're in this, this spirit of chaos that we're in, and this darkness and this madness that we're experiencing right now. And you talk about murder. Well, we've murdered 100 million babies, and we have justified it with man's own thinking. We've ignored God altogether, and God has in a sense left us up, to our own devices. And with all the negative results of that, we're slow to discern the consequences of that worldview and the choices that we've made over the last 50 years.
Yeah, because we've become very, very comfortable. There's no doubt about it. And so when you become comfortable, often you become soft. I think that saying that's gotten around in recent years, hard men create good times create soft men or weak men, and weak men create hard times like that. It's a certain pattern.
Well, you're back. It's like the book of Judges all over against that cycle of nations, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. There's no question about it. And that's why we really have to put some thought into these things. But it's a tough thing to do because so many people are operating emotionally now. And by the way, that's what happens when you're disconnected from truth. I mentioned that Barna research earlier. Well, here's another thing it found that vindicated something I'd always said. I said, well, if you believe in truth and you have to make a quote moral decision, you refer to truth. You try to discern what it is.
Right.
Okay. But if you don't have truth to use as your yardstick, what do you have left to use? The only really compelling thing you have left are your feelings, your emotions. And I think that's a major reason why so many people are so emotion driven nowadays. And what did Barna find? He found in his research that that's what most Americans said, or at least a plurality, that the most common way in which they made these so-called moral decisions was based on what felt right. that's what happens when you drift away from truth. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look at it again. When you and I were growing up in the latter 60s, 70s, you loved the one you were with. The music of the era, which, I thought was quite interesting because you had two parallel dynamics. You had this dynamic of free love and Woodstock, and then you had a Jesus revolution that's taking place simultaneously. And I've thought about that often, Selwyn, that here it is. We had an opportunity. We were at a critical cultural crossroads. Were we going to choose life or were we going to choose death once again?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned abortion before, which really I like to call prenatal infanticide because that's
Mm,
what it is. But it's interesting. It makes me think back to this story from my high school days. I think it was my sophomore year, maybe. I'm not sure. But anyway, we had this very interesting English teacher who would pose a lot of philosophical questions. And
mhm.
he asked the class one day, if you could press a button and you'd get $1 million, but a little old man in China somewhere would die, a little old man with no family, no associations at all, would you press that button? And about a third of the class raised their hands in the affirmative. So I think that's
Wow.
very telling. Yeah.
Mm,
Again, that shows what a lack of respect for life prevails nowadays. And of course,
mhm.
though, it's not surprising when you descend into this relativistic morass, like I said, because
Exactly.
who's to
Mm,
say what's right or wrong? It's whatever
right.
works for you, right? We've heard that over and
Mm.
over again. And you
It
don't
was,
have to be a bad person to believe that. You
mm.
just have to have been inculcated with the wrong philosophical foundation.
And how far down the road have you gone with that inculcation? I mean, that was then 30% of the class. What do you think that number would look like today?
It might be higher, especially in a place like New York City. That's where I grew up, by the way. I was in the
Uh,
Bronx, so not
uh,
Manhattan, but still the Bronx. It
yeah.
probably would have been better in some other areas, but it certainly hasn't gotten better with time, as you said, because unfortunately, that moral decay has continued because we have not had that application of energy that I was talking about. And it's very necessary. And by the way, that means all of us have to turn this discerning eye inwards, and we have to say, what can we do differently in our lives to be
Yes.
one of those 1,000 points of light, to be more virtuous? Because let me tell you something. If even a sizable minority of us became heavier in terms of virtue, so to speak, we
Mm,
could really start tilting the country in the other direction. And I'm going to lay some things out there. Some people
yeah.
may not like hearing this, but how about this? Profanity has become so common nowadays. How about this? Just stop cursing.
Yeah.
Stop cursing. Make that
Mhm,
resolution. That's a good one right there. How
mhm.
about this? If you say you believe in God, act like it. It's not something just for 1 hour a week in church. Do you
Exactly.
say grace over meals with your kids? I'm not saying you have to beat them over the head with the Bible,
Mhm.
but in church, we have this thing where we go like this. Okay, that means may God always be on my mind, on my lips, and in my heart. Okay,
Yes.
we complain, for instance, about the attack on Christmas, and Christmas is coming up, of
Mm,
course,
mhm.
how it's been wiped off school calendars, for instance, and people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to say Merry Christmas. But why should that surprise us when we have taken ourselves, God, out of our minds, off our lips, and out of our hearts?
Exactly.
How is it being demonstrated that he resides there? Again, are you saying grace over meals with your kids? Do you talk about God sometimes with your family? I'm not saying you have to be obsessed till they get sick of it. I'm
Mhm,
just saying God has to be an obvious presence in our lives. And if he's not, then we shouldn't complain about what's happening with the culture, because
mhm.
then it's just a reflection of us, isn't it?
Exactly. Well, I was reminded here again of the Shema, the Israel prayer 3 times a day that is prayed. And that is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. And it goes on to admonish the adults or those that are making the prayer, particularly adults, though, because that they are to talk about this as they sit down, as they lie down, in their walking about with their children, so that you're constantly reminding them again that God is the center of your universe. But I would agree with you, Selwyn, that if we take individual responsibility to just I say think a little bit better, do a little bit better, be a little bit better. Okay. And simple things, just being conscious of, the language that you speak, being conscious of being kind for a moment. I like what the story of Benjamin Franklin, what he would do is take a virtue every week and just really focus on that one virtue, like being kind. And, at the end of the day, and maybe even during the day, he would say, was I kind? Did I lack kindness? Do I need to be more kind? And he would focus on kindness for an entire week. It doesn't take a whole lot, considering all the time that we spend in front of these devices. The kids are spending 6 to 8 hours. We're probably spending an equal amount of time in front of all these things. Why can't we set aside just a moment of time to remember that it's all about God, not about us?
Yes, well, absolutely. And there's something else we can do. This is very important. G.K. Chesterton said, quote, "Thanks are the highest form of thought." And I think he
Yeah.
might have been right about that, because you
Oh,
see,
yeah.
when you're thankful, when you have a grateful heart, you're recognizing a very high truth, a very lofty truth, which is that we're sinners. We really don't deserve anything but damnation, but we're not going to get that because God is good and he offers us his salvation. And everything we get is a gift. Everything we get is icing on the cake. And I will tell you something else, even if you're a secularist, listen to this. This is one of the secrets to happiness in life, because when you're thankful, you don't see that glass as being half empty. You always seeing it as being half full. And that's very
Right.
important. You're always thankful. Thank you, Lord, for this. Thank you, Lord, for that. Chesterton said, "You say grace over a meal. All right. But I say grace when I dip the quill into the ink." And he was
Mhm.
expressing a very important truth there. Everything we have is a gift. And that
Amen.
is so
Mhm.
lacking nowadays. When you see all these people protesting and angry because they've been denied this or they've been denied that, and they think they
Mhm.
deserve some right they shouldn't have, or they think they
Right.
deserve some benefit they shouldn't have. What's lacking is the truth that I just articulated. They don't understand it. They
Exactly.
have an ungrateful heart instead of a
Mhm.
grateful heart. And if you have that grateful heart, you're going to be happier. Why? Because you're going to see yourself as getting gifts all the time, not
Yeah.
as being denied your birthright all
Right.
the time. And as I
Uh,
think Chesterton also said, but I'm not sure, he said, goods look a lot better when they come wrapped as gifts. And
yeah.
that's how you see them, as gifts.
Well, let me say this, Selwyn. I'm thankful for you. And we got to leave it there. We gave so much to our audience to ponder. And I pray that it would be a blessing to them, that they would go into the rest of this season of Thanksgiving, this Advent season that leads to, you talk about being wrapped in a gift, this great gift that's just a few weeks away that God gave to all his creation. Selwyn Duke, the writer for The New American, has been our guest. Thank you, Selwyn. I appreciate you. God bless.
Thank you, Bill. The feeling's mutual, and God bless you too and
Well,
your
our
audience.
thanks to Selwyn Duke, as I say, the writer for The New American. And our thanks to you for being a part of the show and sharing a part of your day with us. May God bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you his peace. Thanks again for being with us. God bless. Take care.